Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duelist video. Today what we thought we'd do is follow up on the last video we did where we predicted the card that we thought might come out with Asana when she releases in late June. Today what we thought is we'd follow up on that by predicting some of the skills, kind of talk a little bit about Wyrms overall, what they're good at, what they're bad at, and the skills we'd like to see come into the game with her release. So let's start by talking about what Wyrms are good at. Wyrms in general are quite good at just having lots of big attack monsters. Their boss monsters tend to have 2500 attack, which is a decent number. They get a field spell that can boost their attack further by an extra 400, so basically their major strength is that they can be 2900 attack during your opponent's turn, which can be difficult for your opponent to out. Even if they do have, let's say, back row hate to pop your field spell and reduce that attack back to 25, they still then have to have a way to get over that 2500. Now, in the current metagame, that's not too difficult, but some decks are better at it than others. The next thing is that their maximum monster is really big. It has 3500 base attack, which might not seem like that much, but one of its effects is that it gains 300 attack for every card in your hand. So if we do just maximum summon it and leave those two cards in our hand, it immediately becomes 4100, which can be a bit problematic. If it gets back to our turn again and we draw up to that full 5 hand, it becomes a 5000 attack monster, which is pretty good. 5000 is difficult to out even with Talismanic Seal Array, because Talismanic Seal Array will only reduce it down to 3000, and then you still have to get over a 3000 attack monster, which is pretty rough. The middle maximum piece as well does have that 2500 attack. So whereas with Yugioh and Magnum Overlord, basically the middle max piece is a bit of a weird card because it's not got the attack stat to really put a lot of pressure on, the Wyrm maximum does, and again with that field spell it becomes 2900, so it just acts as a 2900 vanilla, which is still quite threatening. You can still clear your opponent's 2500 boss monsters, which is very relevant. The next thing that the Wyrms are generally quite good at is summoning out lots of monsters. Build Dragon itself is able to bring back any normal monster from your graveyard, which means if we do have high attack, high level normal monsters in the graveyard, we can still just bring them back just as easily as a 1500 vanilla. So bringing back a 1500 vanilla is still decent, right? Having that on the field is still okay. But bringing back something like a 2400 attack monster, which can get a boost from your field spell again up to like 28, or what we're more expecting is going to be the 19, which will get boosted up to 23, is still very good. It's still not super easy for your opponent to out a board of 2300 attack plus monsters. And finally, Wyrms do have really good trap cards, but a lot of types do have those good traps. Dinosaurs have really good trap cards, but if Konami doesn't actually release those trap cards, it doesn't really matter how good they could be if we don't actually have access to them. So because Konami have been very reluctant to release very powerful trap cards into the game, I'm not sure if we will see those traps, but if we do, the Wyrms traps specifically are actually pretty good. Now we'll talk about some of the Wyrms weaknesses. So the first is that Wyrms are kind of reliant on field spells. A lot of their effects don't work unless you have a field spell face up on the field, which can get problematic, as well as the fact that if you don't have that field spell, a lot of their stats are, I mean, they're still fine. 2500 and 1500 respectively are still okay stat lines, but we don't have those ways to boost them up above that 2500 threshold without the field spells. Now, obviously, we could get a skill that does this, which would be fine, but because of the way that Wyrms are very field reliant, it would make more sense just give us the field spell or have skills that maybe give us the field spell, for example. The other major weaknesses, this is what you'll hear people talk about a lot with the Wyrms, is they're not very good at beating set 3 pass. So in general, Wyrms really lack tools to get through 3 defense position monsters. They don't have any double attack, they don't have a way to pop monsters, they don't have any piercing. At least they didn't when Wyrms initially released in 7s, and thus we don't really expect them to have any of those tools because they're kind of their Go Rush tools that will be released later on, we would expect, in Duel Links. The maximum also does suffer from this, where the maximum is a big ball of attack that can pop back row, but lacks the ability to actually get damage in. So unless we get a really good skill to fix some of these problems, I would actually expect a lot of people to be on set Mighty Gaze of the Sky Emperor just to be able to get to your opponent's life points, because if you can't get through set 3 pass, a lot of the time you're not really going to be winning the game. You're going to give your opponent plenty of time to find that out to your big bad next. So what would the worst case scenario be? I think the absolute worst case would be that Konami just gives us no tools to deal with set 3 pass, and then we have to run either cards in our deck like Stop Defense or Pierce or Torna, or we just have to use Mighty Gaze of the Sky Emperor. Now, that's not the end of the world, but it would be a bit disappointing to not have a Wyrm-specific skill, or for our Wyrm-specific skills to be lackluster enough that we don't want to use them. I think that would be, again, kind of the worst case scenario. I think the next probably worst thing we could do, but it still kind of fits on theme, would be a skill that just lets us start with Peaks of Blistopia in play. Now, this could be a little bit annoying for some players, just because with Peaks of Blistopia, our 1500 vanillas become 1900 vanillas, and our 2500 attack boss monsters become 29, which is quite big. That can be quite hard to deal with, so I can understand people not wanting that to be, but realistically, if those cards do come out anyway, we'll be able to do that, whether or not we do it on turn 1 or not. And again, having easy access to that field spell will help a little bit with consistency, I guess, but it won't solve our overall problem of we can't beat set 3 pass. So the best case scenario would be that we get a skill that does overcome the Wyrm's weaknesses. This would be something like Hysteric Forces, which lets us change a monster on our opponent's field from face down defense to face up attack, so we can attack over and get some damage in. Maybe something that gives one of our monsters piercing, just something like that, some way to help us get damage in through set 3 pass. Because again, if we don't have access to that, it might feel a little bit underwhelming to play the Wyrms. And the other thing to take note of is that with the field spell putting our monsters up by 400 attack, will Wyrms be too strong? With a good skill, Wyrms could become a crazy strong meta threat. If we think about having 2900 boss monsters, if we think about having 1900 beaters, and then having a good skill on top of that, that could be enough to actually push them way over the edge. Now, this is what makes me think that maybe we won't get a skill to help beat set 3 pass, because Konami will be like, oh, well, the deck's already really good at just kind of bullying other people. Do they really need to get damage in as well? And to that I say yes, we really do need a way to get damage in. I think unless we do get a skill which does that, I probably will just be using Mighty Gaze of the Sky Emperor. Now, I'll be obviously testing all the different new Wyrm skills we get, but that would be my prediction for what the default skill people will fall back on is. So my conclusions are, assuming we get Peaks of Blistopia and not Silver Mountain, Wyrms will have easy access to very high attack monsters, the 1900s and the 29s, and might feel like a bit of a bully. They might be able to throw their weight around quite a lot. A lot of decks might struggle to actually out these monsters, and that could create frustrating game states. Because of that, Konami might deem that our deck needs a weakness, and our weakness is not being able to beat set 3 pass, so we might not get that. And again, like we said before, if Wyrms don't get a skill to deal with that set 3 pass, Mighty Gaze might be what players do go to. I really do think that Wyrms are poised to be very, very strong in the current metagame. Just because Gaze of the Sky Emperor exists, that does mean that potentially there is something there, even if we don't get a Wyrm specific skill. Wyrms have always been a fan favourite, Asana has always been a fan favourite. I've already spoken to a ton of people which are really, really excited to pick up Wyrms, and a lot of people are expecting Wyrms to be a very, very strong deck. So I think the absolute worst case is that Wyrms come out and they don't receive the support that they need, maybe because Konami's a little bit afraid of them being a little bit too strong, and then they are a bit of a flop. I think the worst thing can happen is that an archetype people are really looking forward to, for example Dinosaurs, do come out to a bit of a whimper because they don't get a good skill, they don't get all of their support cards, we're still waiting for the dinosaur traps, and I think it would be such a shame for Wyrms to get the same treatment. Realistically, we're going to get some Wyrm skills because Asana is going to be a playable character. But those skills don't have to be good, they could all be terrible, which would be a real letdown, especially because I personally really love the Wyrms. I mean, I really love the dinosaurs as well, so Konami, if we could also get a dinosaur skill and all the dinosaur traps, that would be fantastic. But thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.